here, baby.
She don't want to stay here. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the question and answer session between Nyth and Ariel and myself at Moosevilla Off Grid.
With Burley in the middle.
With Burley in the middle? Oh my gosh! I think Burley's the cutest. Well, no, maybe Ariel, but you know, she's married now, so I can't say that. Burley's the cutest. So, some of you guys know Ariel very well, and some of you know me very well, and some of you know both of us very well. So those of you who don't know one or the other, Ariel lives in a tiny house, I don't know, 45 minutes or so from where I live, and we both live in western Wyoming somewhere. And one of the things I did was ask my contributors or my viewers if they had any questions, and they sent me a few of them, and so we're going to sit here and just kind of talk to each other and answer these questions, and then plus anything else that we happen to come up with. We've been friends for a number of years. We both share a love of photography and wild animals and kind of roughing it, you know, doing things our own way. And so we kind of gravitated towards each other, and that leads us to our very first question that one of the viewers sent in, which was, how long have we known each other and how did we meet?
Am I supposed to answer?
Yeah, why not?
As I recall, we were both on Facebook in a group called Tiny House People, which is a pretty giant group of folks interested in some way or another with tiny houses. And I think I had just moved into mine and Moose was finishing building Moosevilla one. He's going to get Burley all wound up. Anyway, we were in similarly cold climates at the time, though several thousand miles apart, so we were both trying to figure out a bunch of the same things. So as I asked questions about wood stoves and he did, and so we just kind of realized that we were doing the same thing, and we first got to be friends through that. And then somewhere in there realized we also both really enjoyed, you know, photography stuff. And then a few years down the road we ended up living kind of close-ish to each other for a while. And so over the years we've just gotten to know each other better and been better and better friends because we happen to have mostly tiny houses and photography as two big life interests that we had in common.
Actually, Ariel was the one that helped me find my place here in Wyoming, because of course when you live in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and you don't know anybody in Wyoming, it's kind of hard to find a place to park your tiny house. And Ariel knew an older couple who had some land, and she put me in touch with this older couple who was interested in making a little bit of money on the side. And after a thorough background check of my financial history, my sexual history, my marriage history, and most any other kind of history you can imagine, they determined that I was a low enough risk to take a chance on. And so that's how I ended up here in this state that I can't pronounce. And that actually leads to one of the other questions that someone had about how do you find tiny house parking? And I'll let you try and answer that one because I know yours is a little different than mine.
Yeah, I think that's very, very individualized. I had done a whole video on how I found the place. My house was parked for nearly 8 years before moving to my own property. But in short, that was found through a contact of a friend that I knew at the time who worked for the landowners. That person is now my husband. We got to know each other much better over the years, but you know, that's how it worked out for me. I know so many different stories. I know of people who have, you know, had setups more like Moose's, where I know this elderly couple, they're kind of like my adopted grandparents, and I knew they could use a little cash and they had some space and he needed a place to park his house, so I put them in touch and let them figure out if that would work for him. I know other people who have, you know, just gone around and, you know, asked, you know, farmers and stuff, like knocked on their door and said, "Hi, we have a tiny house. We'd like to park in this area. Looks like you have, you know, some space in the back of your field. Is that something you'd consider?" And, you know, the worst somebody can say is no, because before I found the spot where I ended up parked for all those years, I tried several people I thought would be options, and for one reason or another, they all ended up being no's, and then an option that I never even thought of ended up being a yes. So I think I can't say there's any like formula, like do X, Y, and Z, and then you'll find the perfect parking spot. But the more people you know, the more people you talk to. I think there's even now, isn't there a tiny house? What's the website? There's something that hooks up people willing to
Right.
have tiny houses, you know, and with people who have them and want a place to park them. But that came into existence after I'd moved into mine, so that wasn't what I used.
Some people want to be in a village type thing where they want to be close to a lot of other people, and that just was not something that appealed to me. And
Me.
yeah, and Ariel and I kind of agree on that. The thing that I have found when talking with people about parking your tiny house is to take a number of pictures with your cell phone, and then when you go to talk to them, they get an opportunity to see what it looks like. And many times your tiny house looks better than their house.
Or I even know people have done like a little brochure to hand out with their photos and stuff, because some people, it's becoming less common now, but a few years ago a lot of people had never heard of a tiny house, so they didn't know what you were talking about if you would say that. So if you could show them like, oh, look at this cute little thing, I'm not talking about a trashy ancient mobile home, it's not going to look like garbage, you know, that definitely helps open up your options.
Yeah, even if you're on somebody's property that looks like a junkyard, you still want to present that you're not that type of junkyard, because they want someone who's going to try to make their place more aesthetically pleasing, if we can put it that way.
And I think that can even be something to think about when you're building your house. I mean, if your dream is to have a tiny house that's like bright pink with polka dots or something on the exterior, you can do that, but you may have to realize that might reduce your options of who wants you parked on their property or where you can park it, and just consider if that works out, because some other people may not think that's as cool as you do.
Exactly. So the next question that one of our viewers sent was, what has been the most challenging task to winter homesteading? And I'm reading off my phone because my mind, I've only got 4 brain cells, and I try to allocate one of those brain cells to something important, and trying to remember all these questions just isn't one of those. So what has been your most challenging homesteading task during the winter?
Oh boy. Probably, well, I don't know, most challenging. It's not really specific to tiny houses, but specific to where I lived for nearly 8 years. Getting to it in the winter was the most challenging. I lived tucked in the woods and up a kind of steep hill that at some times was drivable and at other times was not. There was plenty of times both in the spring and fall when it was just too muddy, and in the winter when either the snow was too deep and it hadn't gotten plowed yet, or it was just a sheet of ice, when I would have to park a little distance from the house and hike in. So you definitely want to plan ahead if you're going to carry your water by hand and various things like that. If I could drive my hill that day, I would try to do everything I could that required moving something, because if I didn't plan ahead, then I was going to be parking a long way and carrying all that stuff up an icy hill by hand. So that was probably the most challenging thing in that location.
Yeah, there's some things that we have to deal with living off grid, like carrying water jugs. Those hold anywhere from 6 to 7 gallons, and with water weighing 8 pounds per gallon, it doesn't take a math whiz to figure out that 50 pounds of water is pretty heavy. And even if you put it in a wagon, when you start pulling it up a hill that's 30 degrees, it's pretty tough. We're also hauling propane bottles, we're hauling firewood,
trees.
Yeah, all kinds of things. So there is a certain amount of planning that goes into making your winter much less painful, if I can use that term. Those of you who watch my channel know that I've recently moved, and that I've gotten a pair of snowshoes and trekking poles, and I've outfitted a way to get water up the hill and things like that. And it's only September. But these are the things you need to think through, because when it gets to be in the middle of November and we have 230 inches of snow, it's not a good time to start thinking these things through.
True, for sure.
And by the way, that's not a real exaggeration. Where Ariel and I have lived here in Wyoming, where she lived before, got approximately 600 inches of snow per year, and where I lived, I got 400 inches of snow per year. So, you know, it is challenging, especially when you're a person who enjoys the ambiance of nature and not the ambiance of a snowblower. So you elect to use a snow shovel instead of a gasoline powered snowblower to move this 400 to 600 inches of snow out of your way.
For everyone who's watched my channel, you've seen that there's been heavier and lighter snow years, but you know, I love hand shoveling snow and I love winter, but there are definitely times when I was shoveling snow over snowbanks above, you know, what I could reach, where I'm having to toss it that high, and once it gets that high, it's kind of a lot of work.
Another one of the questions we had was concerns or challenges of solo tiny house life for men or for women. So I guess this is for both Ariel and I. And Ariel has recently gotten married, but her husband lives in a different city, so she's still somewhat solo. So I think you're still
We're back
facing...
and forth now, but I did have 7.5 years of doing it completely solo, of experience to go on.
So what were some of your challenges?
Specifically related to being solo. The first thing I think of is it's a lot easier because you make if you're going to build your own tiny house, you build it exactly to fit you, and you don't care what works or doesn't for anybody else. You make it, you know, work for what you want, what you do in life, the stuff that's important to you. You know, I have room for all my cooking and canning stuff, photography stuff, you know, etc., because that's what's important to me. And so my house was built very well, and this many years later, I'm still very happy with how well it fit me. There are always, I guess it's not really specific to a tiny house, but if you're going to live alone and in a more remote location, there's always the risks of, you know, if something happens to you, if you fall down and hit your head and you're knocked unconscious and it's below zero outside, how soon is somebody going to find you? That never happened to me, but it did happen to a good friend of mine who lived on the other side of the country. She actually was married, but her husband didn't find her for several hours, and she nearly died because that happened. She was knocked unconscious, and she's a very, you know, petite little woman. She nearly froze to death. So thankfully nothing like that ever happened, and I do have, you know, good friends, and I talk to them regularly, but, you know, you don't usually talk to anybody every single moment, so there could definitely be stretches of hours where something went wrong and nobody would realize it, and I would say that's probably the biggest risk, I think, in that kind of lifestyle choice. But I'm also less likely to get killed in a traffic accident because I'm not in traffic, so, you know, there's ups and downs.
And I think the biggest concern for myself is one that Ariel shares, and that's that both of us like our own space, and we don't necessarily want someone that is uninvited in our space. In other words, we have a sense of privacy that we like to maintain, and we don't want people just showing up unannounced. And tiny houses kind of remind people who've never lived in one of a shed that they can just go up and open the door and walk in and stuff. And I've had people do that to me before when I was living in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Someone just walked up the steps to my house and walked right in the front door. And that's a pretty good way to find a dead body lying next to the front door, because this is my private home. So I think that's one thing that we share living solo, and I don't think that has anything to do with being a man or a woman, although I do think it's a little bit more sensitive for a woman. A man generally is not going to face some of the same problems that a woman would.
And I never had that actual experience, but partly because my house was parked in an area where nobody could, I mean, I was far enough away from everything that nobody could just like drive by and see it and think, oh, that's cute, I should go look at that. So I'm sure it would have happened otherwise, but because that was the situation, it just didn't.
Let's see what the next question is. Tell us about your camera equipment.
Oh, I have a bunch of it. I use it all every day. We're currently looking at 2 cameras running that right now. I have 2 big cameras. I've got a video where I go into great detail on what gear I use regularly, but usually one keeps a very long lens on it. I use that for wildlife photography for the most part, or tame life photography, dogs, cats, chickens, you know, that kind of thing. And the other has a more wide-angle lens on it, and that's what I use usually for filming, you know, cutting up firewood projects, gardening, cooking, you know, whatever else is going on around the place. And then I got a little tiny camera that I can like put on a backpack strap and carry right here for when I'm hiking miles around the mountains and don't want to, you know, lug many extra pounds of camera gear. And it's also a nice camera, but it doesn't quite do everything that a big dedicated SLR does.
And both of us use Canon, so we are able to talk the same language back and forth. And I've worked for quite a few years as a professional wildlife photographer, so I have some of the same equipment that Ariel has, plus a lot more.
Stuff.
I've got a lens that, you know, when you take the lens, the camera, the tripod and everything, it tops out at about 35 pounds. So after you haul that around for a bit, you really don't need to go to CrossFit. But both of us love animals and we love being out in nature. The other thing that we found out from our photography trips together is we both prefer not to be in crowds. And that's one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of videos from either one of us from the Tetons, because it's just gotten arduous to go up there where there's 300 to 700 people by the side of the road and rangers and everything telling you go here and go there, whereas Ariel and I can get together and sit one person in the front seat, one person in the back seat, and photograph a mountain lion for 4 continuous days and never see another human being the entire time. And
yeah, so even though we both live within a day's driving range of, you know, some very famous national parks with lots of wildlife in them and lots of opportunities, and we've both photographed there before, it's just not that much fun to me. So yeah, I would rather spend, earlier this spring, we did spend dozens of hours sitting in a cold car, smelling a rotting dead elk carcass together, while waiting and waiting and waiting, and then got a few really spectacular shots of a totally wild mountain lion. There was not another person in sight. This was, you know, in a remote location on private property, very near national forest, and for both of us, we just enjoy an experience like that substantially more than being on a road edge with hundreds or thousands of other people in a crowd.
I've had people ask me before, what is it like to be a professional wildlife photographer? And I've described it as multiple hours of tedium punctuated by moments of intense excitement. And
we're not just hours of tedium, sometimes days or weeks of tedium.
Yeah, exactly. It's not unusual to go out and spend weeks waiting on an animal. I did that once out in California where I waited weeks and weeks to take a photograph of a mountain lion, and then I got maybe 7 seconds with him. But that's part of what it's really like in the real world. Okay, the next question we have is compare water sources we have used. And of course, I have spent part of my time on someone else's land in which I had access to water. When I was up in the Upper Peninsula, all I had to do was go to the house and fill up a couple of jugs, and so I had water. I've never been directly connected to a hose, and I never plan to. I don't want that risk in my tiny house of a pipe bursting. So even though it's a pain in the neck to continue to fill the tank, that's how I prefer to live. I lived on a sailboat for 11 years and had to fill the tank all the time, so that just works very well for me. How about your water sources? Yours has recently changed.
Yeah, so for a lot of the years, I lived where I had to drive a few miles to a neighbor's well that had great water, and I filled up my water jugs there, drove them back either up the hill if it was drivable, or carried them up the hill if it wasn't, and then poured them into my water tank. And so again, like Moose, I wasn't connected to any hose source, which in addition to, like he mentioned, you don't risk filling your entire tiny house with water. We've both lived in some really cold places, and if I had had the option, which I didn't, of just connecting a hose to the house consistently, keeping that from freezing and bursting would have been a massive undertaking requiring either lots of digging and trenching, or lots of insulating, or lots of heat taping and lots of power to run it, or something like that. So for me, it was simpler to simply fill the house. Then my entire water system was internal, and as long as the entire house didn't freeze, I wasn't going to get anything that froze or burst or exploded or leaked. So that worked really well. Now my husband and I recently have moved to our own property, and we have gravity-fed spring water that comes out of a hydrant there, and it is still, for kind of the same reasons, not directly connected to the house. Now I don't have to carry my jug so far. I can, take a hose right to the house tank and fill it, and that is very much more convenient, for sure, to do that. But I just fill my internal tank just like I always have, and then, roll the hose up. So again, I've got nothing connected that can explode or freeze or anything like that. But it is handier to not have to hand carry your water.
So how large is your tank?
I think it's 35 gallons, plus I have a 10-gallon tanked water heater that's a propane water heater. So if they're both full, then I have 45 gallons in the house.
And how long does that last you if you don't fill it?
If I don't fill it, it's usually lasted me about 2 weeks. It depends a little bit what all I'm doing, how many dishes I'm watching, how many guests I have over. I recently started using my shower for the first time, in the house, because before I was too lazy to want to carry that much water. Now that's a little easier to fill. I'm a little more willing to fill it more often. So if I take a couple showers, then I have to, fill it more often. But I'm still probably filling it, I don't know, every 10 days or so,
okay.
Something like that.
And I've got a 25-gallon tank and a 6-gallon hot water heater. And on average, I'm filling mine once a week, and I do take a shower each day because, well, if you were close to me and I hadn't had a shower, you'd know why. So let's go on to the next question here. What food preservation methods do you prefer? And I'm just getting started with it, so I don't have an answer here.
I prefer fresh, and then probably in order of options as far as flavor and nutrition, I think frozen is the next most tasty and nutritious. Also requires the most space and power to store frozen things. I really like dehydrated and canned for a lot of things. I do a lot of my own canning, making pickles, applesauce, canning peaches, all kinds of things, making jams, jellies, fruit juices, I've canned meats, and so on. And I've also dehydrated a lot. I really like dried fruits and veggies, since I also enjoy backpacking a lot. And again, kind of like with the camera, weight is an issue if you're going to carry everything on your back. Dehydrated food with all of the water gone is very lightweight to carry, so I've definitely done plenty of my own dehydrating to take on backpacking trips. And fermenting. I do sauerkraut and kombucha and fermented things like that. So I would say I do all of them. There's some things I really prefer more frozen or canned or whatever when I have to, preserve them. So it kind of varies by individual food item, but I would say I do all of it.
Yeah, Ariel's almost what you would call an expert at this thing, and I'm on the other end of the spectrum. If you consider a pendulum that goes from one side to the next, I'm all the way on the other side. So if you want to laugh your face off, come onto my channel and watch me do some preserving, because I do almost everything wrong the first, second, and third time.
Almost everybody does.
Yeah.
I'm just a little past my first, second, and third time with most of it.
And that leads right into the next question. One of our viewers wanted to know, how do you manage without having a root cellar, since you have so many potatoes, carrots, garlic, and so on? How do you keep those from having problems?
That's tough, because kind of like the same reason my water tank doesn't freeze. My whole house is nice and warm with that little wood stove going in the winter. There's not really any good root cellar place, and where I was living before, it wasn't my own property for one thing, but I also lived basically on top of a granite hillside, so digging something underground far enough below frost line to store things in did not make any sense to try to do in that location. So I've kept things under the sink. That's kind of the furthest corner from the stove and stays coolest. I've also stored overflow there's a pretty big shop on that property where I lived, and they didn't mind if I stuffed some extra crates of potatoes in the back corner there. It was heated enough that nothing froze in there, but it stayed at like 50 degrees, which isn't quite root cellar temperature, but it was close. And I had onions and potatoes that would last from fall till spring, which is a lot of months here, because fall is, you know, now, and spring is like June. So, yeah, and by the end of the year, but that's true, you know, if you have a good root cellar. You know, some of the potatoes will get a little bit soft, and a few of the onions will be sprouting, but it works pretty well. My husband and I do plan to build a root cellar as we have time, so having a real dedicated one has been high on my priority wish list for a long time, because that would make a lot of things easier, for sure.
Ariel has really inspired me to try some of the same things that she has been doing for so long, and it's one of the wonderful things about YouTube. Once you start to follow someone, you start to see things you would not have considered doing on your own. And as a guy, I'm just never been exposed to canning and things like that. But now that I've grown my own garden, well, grown my own
great
potatoes.
Success. His potatoes were spectacular this year. Mine looked horrible. I was very jealous of his.
And stuff. But having grown all those potatoes, I don't want them to go bad now. So I'm learning how to can and things like that. And our final question comes from a viewer who wanted to know, what weather service or app on your phone do you use to know when it's going to freeze? Because you seem to know the exact temperature of almost any time of the day.
I don't have an answer. There is no app. For one, I have an old flip phone, so I don't even have a phone that has apps. I have an old dumb phone. I usually check 3 or 4 weather forecasts in my area. If I check like the Weather Channel forecast and AccuWeather, and there's a local forecaster. If I check all 3, and all 3 say the same thing, they all say it's going to rain, or they all say it's going to sun, or it's going to be warm, or it's going to be cold, I assume there's a reasonable chance of what they are predicting happening. When one says it's going to be hot, and one says it's going to be cold, and one says it's going to be dry, and one says it's going to be rainy, I assume that whatever the worst case scenario is going to happen. And then everywhere I've lived, you know, because the forecast is usually done for whatever the closest town or city or something is, usually those places have been warmer than where I've actually been tucked up on the hillside. So I kind of went with the rule of thumb that anytime one forecast would say it was going to be, you know, 39 or anything colder, I would assume I'm going to freeze. Even if the town gets to 39, and if one forecast says 39 for a low and another one says 42 and the other one says 40, I just assume it's going to freeze, because it's easier to be safe than sorry. So anytime there was any forecast that said 30 anything, Fahrenheit that is, where we live, you know, I would assume that I was going to get a freeze and prepare accordingly, pretty much. Plus, you also get a feel for the weather. I spend the majority of my day outside, and you can just, there's been times I looked up and I looked at the sky and I looked at how the air felt, and I thought, you know, the forecast says it's not going to get cold, but I think they're wrong. It feels like it's going to. You know, because you just, after you live in an area long enough and you spend, you know, from sun up till after dark outside most days, you do get a feel for that.
And that's one of the complications for living in the mountains. The weather can change almost 10 minutes later. You can have rain on one side of the road and no rain on the other. You can have snow on one side of the road and sunshine on the other.
You can have a hard freeze in the morning with ice on everything, and it can be 90 by the afternoon.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, a lot of it is experience, and also just understanding that the weathermen just don't know either. And so you have to go by your best gut instinct.
And if you're trying to grow a garden and not freeze it, I figure it's better safe than sorry. So I'm better off taking the time to cover everything and not have it freeze than to risk, you know, that it'll be okay and lose everything and whatnot.
And that's what happened to me. I planted my garden this year. I had green peppers and I had dill and a bunch of other herbs and all these potatoes. And it froze 4 days after I planted my garden, and I lost everything except my chives and my potatoes. Actually turned out to be a benefit, because the potatoes grew so big there wasn't room.
All your space.
Yeah, there wasn't room for anything else in there. But that's all the questions we have. And, you know, as we said in the beginning, if you haven't gone over to Nyth's channel to check it out, please run on over there. Her channel is very much the same as mine. And also, those of you who are on Ariel's channel at Nyth,
go check out Moose's, because he does lots of cool stuff.
So, you know, we kind of complement each other, but we do things a different way. Ariel has most of her schooling by homeschooling, and I've got, more degrees than a thermometer and stuff, but, we kind of meet in the middle, and it's really interesting because we do a lot of the same things and agree on a lot of the same things, even though we're totally different. She's blonde and beautiful, and I'm old and wrinkly. But
and I think that's the most interesting, because what I try to share, and I think Moose does the same thing, is just like what I've done and how it worked out. You can, if you watch every video on my channel, you'll see some ups and downs and backs and forths, but I think it's instructive if you want to do something similar to look at, like, how did I do it? How did he do it? How did somebody else do it? And not just, I don't know everything. I can't try everything in one lifetime, and that's true of everyone. So I think it's often helpful if you can get, the feedback and experience of multiple people and be like, oh, look, the way he set that up, that works much better. We saw she tried that and it didn't work, so we don't even need to waste our time and, and energy on that.
So everybody, thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks for, listening to us kind of ramble on and talk back and forth to each other. If you do have any questions, just leave them down below, either on Ariel's channel or my channel, and we'll get back to you and make things a little bit clearer. If you would, hit the thumbs up icon, because that helps the YouTube algorithm somehow. I don't understand all of this black box stuff, but they say that's a good thing to do. And also go ahead and subscribe to Ariel's channel and my channel if you haven't already. And we'll see you guys back on our respective channels again very soon. We'll probably do this again, as this is a lot of fun.
Have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.
Over here at Nyth, thank you so much for watching these videos and spending some of your very valuable time choosing to do that. We hope you found something that was useful, educational, helpful, maybe save someone else some time and trouble, or just something just plain beautiful. If you don't want to miss any videos, subscribe and hit the bell. And thanks for coming along on our journey as we build a new little homestead with our tiny house and everything to come.